At 70, Michael Anthony exposes Eddie Van Halen. For 4 decades, Michael Anthony stood a few feet from one of the loudest guitar sounds rock music ever produced, and somehow he was still the guy fans forgot to talk about. He wasn't the one doing the tapping solos or the one strutting across the stage in spandex, screaming into the crowd. He was the steady one, the guy who showed up early, plugged in, and made sure the whole thing actually sounded like a band instead of a guitar player with a rhythm section attached. Now in his 70s, with Eddie Van Halen 6 years gone, and the dust finally starting to settle on one of rock's messiest family sagas, Michael Anthony has had the time and the distance to say what he really thinks. And what comes out isn't scandal so much as a slow, sad unraveling of loyalty, one phone call, one signature, and one magazine interview at a time. A trumpet player's kid who wanted to be different. Anthony's path into music didn't start with a guitar at all. His father played trumpet, and the sound of a horn practicing in the house was simply part of growing up. Michael picked up the instrument himself as a kid, and by the time his family had settled in Southern California in mid-1960s, he was marching in the school band at Dana Junior High in Arcadia, learning what it meant to play in time with other people rather than just for himself. It was rock and roll that eventually pulled him away from brass. Around 13, tired of being one more kid in a lineup of guitar players, Anthony gravitated toward bass simply because almost nobody else wanted to play it. A friend loaned him a guitar that he stripped down to 4 strings to improvise a makeshift bass, and when his father noticed how seriously his son was taking it, he bought him a real Fender Precision bass and an amplifier to match. Anthony leaned into players like Jack Bruce and John Paul Jones, taught himself to play right-handed despite being naturally left-handed, and built the kind of disciplined, unshowy technique that would later become his signature: reliable, in the pocket, never in anyone's way. The night a PA system made history. By the early 70s, Anthony was gigging around the San Gabriel Valley with a band called Snake, splitting time between bass and lead vocals. Snake wasn't chasing a record deal. It was playing school dances and local clubs, the kind of grind that either burns young musicians out or sharpens them. On one of those nights, Snake ended up sharing a bill with another local act called Mammoth, fronted by 2 brothers named Alex and Eddie Van Halen. When Mammoth's sound system failed mid-show, Anthony offered up his own band's equipment so the night wouldn't be a total loss. It was a small, practical gesture, but it stuck with the Van Halen brothers. Not long after, Mammoth lost its bass player, and the brothers remembered the guy who'd bailed them out. They invited Anthony to a garage jam session, and it clicked immediately. His aggressive, locked-in bass, playing paired with a genuinely powerful high voice, gave the band something it hadn't had before. He was in. Soon after, the group discovered another band was already using the name Mammoth, so they renamed themselves after the brothers whose last name would end up on every marquee for the next 50 years, Van Halen. The quiet engine behind the noise. By the time Van Halen's self-titled debut landed in 1978, the classic lineup, David Lee Roth up front, Eddie on guitar, Alex on drums, Anthony on bass, was already a machine. Anthony's bass lines held down songs like Runnin' with the Devil, and his high, piercing backing vocals became as recognizable as Roth's screams or Eddie's tapping. If you've ever heard a Van Halen chorus and felt like there was a strange, soaring third layer sitting on top of the guitar and lead vocal, that was Anthony's voice doing exactly what it was built to do. In the band's early years, by most accounts including that of former manager Noel Monk, Anthony was treated as a full and equal partner, an even split of income, expenses, and decision-making among all 4 members. That equality wouldn't last. As the band's fame and internal power struggles grew through the late 70s and into the 80s, the balance of control began tilting hard toward the Van Halen brothers and Roth, and Anthony's stake in the band he'd helped build started quietly shrinking. 1984, the signature that changed everything. The year Van Halen released 1984, the album with Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher, the record that turned them from a hard rock band into a genuine pop culture phenomenon, is also, according to Monk's own account, the year Anthony's financial future inside the band was effectively rewritten. Monk has said that during that tour, Anthony was presented backstage, hours before a show, with paperwork that stripped away his future songwriting credits and royalties, and that it was retroactive enough to cost him a stake in 1984 itself, the very album he was on tour supporting. Monk has said he would have advised against it had he known in time. Anthony went ahead and signed anyway, reportedly to keep the peace and keep the tour moving. It's hard to overstate what that moment cost him. 1984 alone would go on to sell more than 10 million copies in the United States. Every future reissue, every compilation, every licensing deal built on songs Anthony had helped shape with his bass and his voice. All of it, for decades, generated essentially nothing for him beyond whatever salary and touring income he was still owed. He didn't go public with it for years. He kept touring, kept recording, kept doing the job, and by the Fair Warning and Diver Down era, critics and fans alike had started to recognize him as one of the quiet reasons the whole thing worked as well as it did, even if his name wasn't on the publishing. I had to show him how to play. If the 1984 contract was the quiet wound, what happened in 2015 was the public one. In a Billboard cover story, Eddie Van Halen, by then long removed from touring with Anthony, who had been replaced years earlier, went after his old bandmates' musicianship directly. He claimed he'd had to personally teach Anthony every note he ever played, describing sessions where Anthony would supposedly come to his house before tours with a video camera so Eddie could walk him through the parts. He dismissed Anthony's voice as lacking real soul, framing those famous harmonies as mostly his own contribution. The backlash was immediate and loud, and it didn't come only from fans. Sammy Hagar, who had spent over a decade fronting the band alongside Anthony, tore into the claims publicly, calling them the biggest fabrication he'd ever heard, and insisting there was never any video camera tutoring session in the 11 years he was in the room. Hagar went further, suggesting it was sometimes the other way around, that Eddie would tell Anthony to simplify his playing, so his own occasional mistakes wouldn't stand out. Anthony himself, for his part, didn't return fire with the same intensity. He said simply that he was proud of what his bass and vocals had contributed to the band's sound, and that he preferred to stay out of the mudslinging because, in the end, it was the fans who got hurt by it. What made the moment sting more than a typical rock band spat is the timeline. This wasn't two guys sniping at each other in real time on tour. It was one former bandmate, years after the fact, publicly dismantling the credibility of a musician who no longer had a stage to answer from, at least not the same one. The slow fade. The Billboard interview didn't come out of nowhere. It was the loud, public version of a demotion that had been happening quietly for over a decade. When Van Halen recorded Van Halen 3 in 1998, Anthony played bass on only a handful of the album's tracks. Eddie handled bass duties on the rest, a small but telling shift in who the band trusted with which parts. By the time the 2004 compilation The Best of Both Worlds rolled around, Anthony didn't play on any of its new songs at all. His name showed up only on backing vocals. That same year brought his final tour with the band, the widely publicized reunion with Sammy Hagar. Even that came with a catch. By Hagar's own account, Anthony had to accept reduced pay and a contract that treated him more like a hired session player than a founding member, just to be allowed on the bus. The tour was a commercial success, but didn't repair anything underneath. 2 years later, in 2006, the band quietly replaced him with Eddie's teenage son, Wolfgang. Anthony has said he didn't get a phone call about it. He learned what was happening the way most fans did, through rumor and reporting. For years, that was the story. A founding member erased from a band he'd helped name, without so much as a heads-up. More recently, Alex Van Halen has offered a different version of events, saying the band did try to reach Anthony before bringing Wolfgang in, and simply never heard back, since Anthony shared a manager with the rest of the group at the time. Whichever account is closer to the truth, the outcome was the same. After roughly 3 decades, Michael Anthony's time as Van Halen's bassist was over, and he found out he'd been replaced the same way everyone else did. Building a life outside the shadow. What Anthony did next says a lot about who he actually is once you strip away the drama. He didn't disappear, and he didn't spend his career litigating the past in public. He reconnected with Sammy Hagar and threw himself into project after project. The other half, a touring act built around Van Halen-era songs from both the Roth and Hagar years, the short-lived supergroup Planet Us alongside Joe Satriani, and most successfully, Chickenfoot, formed in 2008 with Hagar, Satriani, and Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Chad Smith. Chickenfoot's debut cracked the Billboard Top 10, proof that Anthony's playing and voice were exactly as valuable as they'd always been, just finally credited to a band where he had an equal seat at the table again. In 2014, he and Hagar formed Sammy Hagar, and the Circle with guitarist Vic Johnson and Jason Bonham on drums, a band that leaned into the catalog Anthony had helped build decades earlier, while also releasing original material that charted in its own right. None of it replaced what Van Halen meant to him, but it gave him something the band's final years hadn't, a place where his contributions were never in question. What exposing Eddie actually looks like. Here's the thing about Michael Anthony at 70, he was never built for a scorched earth confrontation, and that hasn't changed. When people ask him now what really happened with Eddie, he doesn't perform outrage. He tells the truth as he experienced it, plainly, and lets the facts do whatever damage they're going to do on their own. He has said in interviews since Eddie's 2020 death that the two of them never got the chance to actually settle their differences, and that he believes if Eddie had lived longer, there's a real chance the two of them would have found their way back to something resembling peace. He's talked about hearing secondhand that Eddie had been open to a kitchen sink reunion tour late in his life, one that would have brought back Anthony, Hagar, and Roth all under one roof, before illness made that impossible. He got a version of closure anyway, not with Eddie, but with Eddie's son. In late 2023, Anthony went to see Wolfgang's band Mammoth WVH play in Las Vegas, and the two of them, the man who was replaced and the young musician who replaced him, sat down together with Wolfgang's mother, Valerie Bertinelli, in the room. Anthony has described it as a genuinely good night, one where a lot of old weight finally lifted. That's the real exposure here, if you want to call it that. It's not a bombshell revelation or a lawsuit or a tell-all built to torch anyone's reputation. It's an old bass player, decades removed from the loudest arguments of his career, choosing honesty over bitterness, admitting the contract he shouldn't have signed, admitting the hurt Eddie's words caused him, admitting the reunion tour that never happened and the goodbye that never came. He isn't tearing Eddie Van Halen down. He's simply, finally, telling his own side of the story out loud, in his own words, on his own terms, something the band itself rarely let him do while it still had a stage. Van Halen's sound was never just Eddie's guitar. It was also the low end holding the whole thing together and the harmony flying above it, night after night, for almost 30 years, mostly without credit and almost never with complaint. At 70, Michael Anthony isn't asking anyone to feel sorry for him. He's just finally getting to finish the sentence the band spent decades cutting him off from.